Hello, my name is Terry Cruz. Myself, along with my classmate Janela, and I will be discussing Chapter 8 Nationalism from our course reading Born in Blood and Fire, A Concise History of Latin America by John Chastain. In order to understand this chapter, we must first define nationalism. Nationalism is defined as an ideology and movement that promotes the interests of a particular nation or a group of people with the aim of gaining and maintaining the nation's sovereignty, which a greater power indirectly maintains or extends influence over the area or people. Nationalism opposed neo-colonialism as it challenged the supposed superiority of European culture. Latin American intellectuals began embracing the new ideologies on race and culture, which celebrated indigenous and African cultures, especially in the form of racial and cultural mixing. For an example, Peru nationalist Jose Carlos Mariátegui embraced the Euro-descendant and mestizo middle classes and elites' indigenous culture by incorporating and speaking indigenous languages. ISI stands for Import Substitution Industrialization. Industrialization became central to nationalism. The goal of ISI was to develop self-sufficiency by creating an internal market within each country. With less income from exports and fewer products available for import, Latin American nations were less able to import the goods they didn't produce domestically. Latin American manufacturers began producing items to replace these imports. This marked the beginning of industrialization in Latin America. Ironically, the Great Depression and the economic hardships of war strengthened the independence of Latin American economies. ISI mostly benefited large nations with large consumer markets such as Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Smaller countries and markets with poor populations didn't see much industrialization. Developments were mostly in light industries such as soap, matches, food products, rather than cars and appliances. The most difficult part of putting together this oral presentation with my classmate was one, at first, getting in contact with one another. However, after communicating through course messages, we were able to finally exchange phone numbers, and from there we were able to evenly divide up the coursework, which made it easier at that point.
Hello, my name is Janela Chavaria. My partner Terry Cruz and I were assigned Chapter 8 in Born in Blood and Fire by John Chastain. This chapter has a lot to do with nationalism in Latin America. The way we went about dividing up the information in the chapters is, of course, outlining the chapter as a whole and then touching on the four main points shared in course materials by Professor Bravo. So, even in the light of oligarchies and dictatorships offering stability to foreign investors, the wave of new nationalism ultimately superseded the intentions held by nativists, fascists, as well as other policies and ways of thinking that challenged the overall nationalist agenda, which is why John Chastain holds nationalism as a critical turning point for Latin America. It was the first time an ideology invoked enthusiastic involvement of an array of people across the social spectrum. The emergence of nationalism was profound in Mexico, which is reflected in the Mexican Revolution. Mexican society was burdened by geographical barriers, social injustice, militant rulers such as Porfirio Diaz, and the power of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, although Diaz brought economic advancement, the profits usually went to the smaller upper class and foreign investors. His rule ultimately left most Mexicans poor, uneducated, landless, and this basically boiled over into the revolution. And the revolution was led by several local leaders such as Emiliano Zapata, Francisco Villa, and Venustiano Carranza. Forgive me if I pronounce these names incorrectly. Now, when Carranza was elected president in 1917, he approved a new constitution that is actually still in force today with amendments. It called for land reform, it called for government control over church estates, and it guaranteed more rights to workers as well as women. This resulted in social reform, where the government set up libraries and schools, economic nationalism, where the government basically brought industries under control and took over those that were foreign owned, and cultural nationalism, where writers and painters such as Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera began to reject the influences of basically European culture. So overall, this new constitution basically gave the government a lot of control. It permitted the breakup of large estates, which helped pave the way for villagers to recover common lands. It limited foreign ownership of Mexican soil, which helped reclaim oil rights from foreign companies, as well as allowing the government more control over natural resources. It also gave the government control over church land, and they ended up disallowing the clergy to wear ecclesiastical clothes in public, as well as prohibiting them from teaching in schools. Um, It also made way for labor regulations where minimum wage was set, protective laws were enacted, and the previously suppressed right to strike was protected. Men were also given the right to vote, and women gained rights as well. So, with Brazil initially being a colony of Portugal, there were already conspiracies to secede from European powers as early as the 1700s. But after the independence of Brazil, there was a desire for self-governance, which was fueled by anti-Portuguese sentiment, which expanded into anti-British and anti-Spanish American sentiment as well, which ultimately kept the country unified. So, compromising Brazil's ability to thrive economically was the crisis in the coffee industry. Um, Coffee was basically Brazil's chief export commodity, and the Great Depression basically reduced coffee revenue, and Brazil ended up facing the misfortune of overproduction. Programs were implemented, such as the coffee valorization program. This was basically meant to guarantee farmers' income during rough times by buying up the excess, but ultimately it couldn't offset the drops in prices. But when dictator Getulio Vargas came to power with support of the army, he implemented the Estado Novo, which means new state. And this new state basically revolved around industrialization. And although Vargas was highly authoritarian in that he dissolved legislative bodies, banned political parties, nationalism helped him maintain his popularity. His implementation of the new state and overall expansion of government basically brought in a flood of new government agencies, the National Steel Company, as well as the National Motor Factory. And to further the nationalist concept, the media was censored, foreign ownership of newspapers was prohibited, and there was assimilation pressure on immigrant communities. Art and literature in Brazil was also highly transformative in the light of nationalism. Moving out of European pride, individuals such as writers Gilberto Freire and Jorge Amado, they promoted Afro-Brazilian heritage. The samba was made Brazil's national dance, and the samba is deeply rooted in Africa and was brought over via West African slave trade. And an entire cultural shift began to take place, and that is highly reflected in the Sao Paulo Modern Art Week, which was an art festival that lasted from February 10th to February 17th of 1922, and historically became the marker of Brazilian modernism. The most difficult part about bringing together the project with my partner would definitely have to be having to communicate solely online. It was a little difficult. But once getting into contact with each other, we just decided to move from Blackboard and just exchange numbers and communicate via the phone, which was a lot better. And things got done a lot quicker, as well as less questions had to be asked, and everything just moved a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. In the future, I would say just exchanging numbers is a lot better, and maybe even meeting in person would be a lot better as well.